This 747 went inverted and crashed less than 2 minutes after takeoff, and it could have all been avoided if there was just better communication in the cockpit. Air India Flight 855 was scheduled to fly from Mumbai to Dubai on January 1st of 1976 in a 747-200. It was carrying 190 passengers as well as 23 crew members. The plane made its way to runway 27 at around 8 p.m. It then took off and began flying over the Arabian Sea. The captain began a right turn as scheduled, but then things started to go downhill. He brought the plane back to level flight, but his attitude indicator still showed that they were in a right bank. As a response, he began rolling the plane left, but when his attitude indicator didn't change, he knew something was wrong. There was a short dialogue between the captain and first officer, but it ended up just leading to more confusion. The investigation found that the two other indicators in the cockpit were in working order, meaning that the first officer should have taken over control, but that never happened. The plane continued its left bank until it rolled more than 100 degrees and crashed into the Arabian Sea, killing everyone on board. This 747 stalled almost immediately after takeoff. The entire horrific crash was caught on camera, and sadly, it could have all been easily prevented. In 2013, a National Airlines cargo 747 was transporting military vehicles weighing a total of 200,000 pounds from Camp Bastion in Afghanistan to the UAE. After a stop at Bagram Air Base and a refueling, the 747 was set to take off again one last time before its final destination. The plane took off at 3:30 in the afternoon local time and began to climb, but it didn't get far. At only 1,200 feet, the 747's nose suddenly rose sharply. The armored vehicle cargo had shifted. It was later determined that the loadmaster didn't secure one of the vehicles correctly, and when it shifted, it caused severe damage to components of the plane's horizontal stabilizer. This left the pilots with very little control of the plane's pitch. There was nothing the pilots could do at this point, and as seen in this tragic video, the plane banked right and then leveled out before crashing into the ground, killing all 7 on board. This co-pilot locked the captain outside of the cockpit and then purposely crashed, killing everyone on board, and sadly it could have all been prevented. On March 24th of 2015, a Germanwings A320 took off from Barcelona, Spain. It was carrying 144 passengers and 6 crew. Only 30 minutes after takeoff, the plane started to make an unscheduled descent. This is when ATC knew something was wrong. First Officer Lubitz waited for the captain to leave the flight deck and then proceeded to lock him out. He began descending without contacting ATC, and this clearly threw up some red flags. Lubitz had been previously hospitalized for severe depression and was even declared unfit for work by his doctor due to, quote, suicidal tendencies, but still flew nonetheless. And eventually, a Dassault Mirage was scrambled to intercept the rogue A320. The black box showed evidence of the captain trying to break into the cockpit when Lubitz didn't let him in. Just 40 minutes after takeoff, sadly, the airliner crashed into a mountain about 60 miles northwest of Nice, France, and tragically, everyone on board died. The collision of this 747 and IL-76 resulted in the deadliest mid-air collision in history. On November 12th of 1996, a Saudia 747 carrying 312 individuals was scheduled to fly from Delhi, India to Dhahran in Saudi Arabia, and at the same time, a Kazakhstan Airlines IL-76 was flying from Shymkent Airport in Kazakhstan to Delhi. Upon takeoff, the 747 was cleared to fly to 10,000 feet, and then just 2 minutes after reaching that altitude, it was cleared again to climb to 14,000 feet. Simultaneously, the IL-76 was about 76 miles from the airport getting ready to land, and ATC had cleared them to descend to 15,000 feet. The Kazakhstan Airlines crew reported reaching 15,000 feet before they were actually there, indicating some kind of miscommunication. ATC told the crew to look out for air traffic about 8 miles ahead. They were referring to the 747. The crew of the IL-76 acknowledged this, and then just about 1 minute later, the planes collided. After an investigation, it was determined that the IL-76's crew didn't follow ATC directions correctly. They descended lower than they were permitted to, and the reason for that was likely due to a language barrier and misunderstanding. In 2001, an Airbus A300 crashed just shortly after takeoff in New York City, claiming hundreds of lives. Just 2 months after the tragic events of 9/11, an American Airlines A300 was scheduled to fly from JFK to the Dominican Republic, carrying 251 passengers and 9 crew members. At 9:11 a.m., the airliner was cleared for takeoff, but was warned of potential wake turbulence from a Japan Airlines 747 that had taken off right before them. The plane took off and climbed to about 1,700 feet before any any issues, at which point they encountered some of that turbulence. This shouldn't have been a big issue, but the first officer's overuse of rudder input after reaching 2,300 feet while trying to stabilize the plane caused the entire vertical stabilizer to break off. The pilots then lost control of the aircraft, and both of the engines also detached from the plane due to excess lateral load as they plummeted towards the ground. No recovery could be made, and just 5 minutes after takeoff, the A300 tragically crashed into a residential neighborhood, killing 260 people on board and 5 individuals on the ground. A Soviet interceptor once shot down a 747 carrying 246 passengers. In 1983, a Korean Airlines flight was scheduled to fly from Anchorage, Alaska to South Korea, a flight path that would take them very close to Soviet airspace. Takeoff went as normal, but just shortly after, the 747 began deviating from its planned flight path, and after being left in heading mode at a heading of 245 degrees, its trajectory meant that it would enter Soviet airspace later in its flight. The deviation increased as the flight continued. The pilots never noticed the mistake, and about 3 hours after takeoff, the 747 entered restricted airspace. Russian interceptors attempted to identify the plane, but under the cover of darkness, they were unable to. One of the interceptors, an Su-15, also fired warning shots, but they went unnoticed by the airliner. After entering Soviet airspace for the second time over Sakhalin Island, one of the Su-15s fired 2 missiles at the Korean airplane, which caused it to crash into the ocean, killing all 269 people on board. This airliner stalled while flying at 35,000 feet above the Atlantic Ocean and subsequently crashed into the water. Sadly, it could have all been prevented. Air France Flight 447 was scheduled to fly from Rio de Janeiro to Paris in an A330 on June 1st of 2009, but about 4 hours after takeoff, the A330 started to experience turbulence and icing conditions. The ice began accumulating in the pitot tubes, which measure airspeed, and subsequently resulted in the incorrect airspeed being displayed. The pilot in control of the plane, Pierre Bonin, pulled back on the side stick, causing the A330 to climb and eventually stall. The other pilot tried to make a correction, but because Bonin was still pulling back on the side stick, the inputs canceled each other out. In the cockpit voice recording, you can hear Bonin say, quote, "We've lost all control of the airplane. We don't understand anything. We've tried everything." I'll put the official reasons for the crash on screen so you guys can take a look at those, but sadly, the pilots never recovered from the stall, and all 228 occupants on board died. This 767 was hijacked, then ran out of fuel and was forced to land in the ocean. In November of 1996, an Ethiopian 767 took off from Addis Ababa and was headed to Port Bouet with a few stops in between. Only 20 minutes after takeoff, 3 Ethiopians hijacked the plane. The 3 hijackers demanded to be taken to Australia, which showed how poorly thought out their entire plan was, considering that Australia was almost 6,000 miles away and the original destination was only about 3,000. The pilots warned them that the fuel wouldn't last, but nonetheless, they insisted. The captain smartly flew towards the Comoro Islands in order to land there, as opposed to running out of fuel over the ocean. After both engines flamed out, the captain attempted to land at the island's main airport, but a fight broke out in the cockpit before he could. In the end, the plane was forced to ditch in the ocean about 1,500 miles from the coast, and sadly, only 50 of the 175 people on board survived. Those 50 remaining people undoubtedly owe their survival to the captain's quick thinking. This 747 disintegrated in midair while carrying 225 people. But why? In 2002, a China Airlines 747 took off from Taiwan and was headed for Hong Kong. Shortly after takeoff, the plane was cleared to climb to 35,000 feet, and just 17 minutes after that, all contact was lost with the China Airlines flight. Earlier in the 747's life, in 1980 to be exact, the 747 had a tail strike while landing. A few months later, permanent repairs were made to the 747, but it was later found out that the repairs done by China Airlines didn't follow the Boeing structural repair manual and thus were insufficient. This lingering issue reared its head, and at 35,000 feet, the 747 broke into at least 4 the incident. This is how one of the world's most famous drummers became one of just 2 people to survive a plane crash. In September of 2008, Blink-182's drummer Travis Barker was set to fly from Columbia, South Carolina to Van Nuys, California in a Learjet 60 carrying 6 people. The jet taxied onto the runway at around midnight, and during takeoff, a loud noise was heard in the cabin. One of the tires had burst. The plane was already traveling 144 knots, 8 knots faster than the highest speed an aborted takeoff could be done. Nevertheless, the captain tried to abort the takeoff, and in the cockpit voice recording, you can hear the first officer saying, quote, "Go, go, go," which, if done, probably would have avoided the entire incident. The captain, Sarah Lemon, had only 8 flight hours as captain of the Learjet, which may have been a contributing factor in the crash. The plane overran, broke through a fence, went across a highway, and then crashed into an embankment, catching fire. Travis Barker and DJ Adam Goldstein were the only survivors, both of which suffered severe burns and later needed skin grafts. This is how a pilot's mistake killed Kobe Bryant. On January 26th of 2020, Kobe Bryant and 8 others, including his daughter, boarded a helicopter at John Wayne Airport in Orange County, California. They were headed to Camarillo Airport, about 80 miles northwest, for a basketball game at Kobe's Mamba Sports Academy. The weather that day was overcast, and at the time of takeoff, the visibility was about 5 miles, but as they headed towards their destination, it would only get worse. The company operating the aircraft was only permitted to fly using visual flight rules, requiring the pilots to have at least 2 miles of visibility and a 1,300-foot cloud ceiling. When approaching Calabasas, the visibility had decreased to about 1 to 1.5 miles, and the pilot began climbing over the mountains and through the clouds, but shortly after, they started rapidly descending. The pilot had become spatially disoriented, and during this descent, he actually thought they were still climbing. They crashed shortly after, sadly killing all 9 people on board. Pause now if you'd like to read the official conclusion from the investigation. An instructor for the Top Gun Maverick movie tragically died in an airshow incident on Sunday while hundreds of spectators watched and recorded. Charles Coleman was an aerobatics instructor, aerospace engineer, airshow and test pilot, as well as being involved in training people like Miles Teller for their role in the most recent Top Gun movie. On October 20th, Coleman prepared for his show at Las Cruces Air and Space Expo in southern New Mexico, something the experienced pilot had done hundreds of times before. He took off in his Extra 300 for an aerobatics performance a little after 2 p.m. and initially everything was going as planned, as this video shows, but that would quickly change. It seems as though one of his maneuvers was performed at too low of an altitude. He then recovers the plane from the stall, but still appears to be too low to pull out of the dive. At 2:30 p.m., Charles Coleman's plane crashed, taking his life with it, and the airshow was immediately called off. The actor Miles Teller had this to say about Charles on X, quote, "He was kind, humble, and curious about others in the world we live in, gone too soon, but his contributions will live on forever. Thanks for the memories, Chuck." Last week, the pilot of a Turkish Airlines A350 died mid-flight. On Tuesday, October 7th, Turkish Airlines Flight 204, operated by an A350-900, prepared for takeoff from Seattle-Tacoma International Airport in Washington for its flight to Istanbul, which was scheduled to take around 11 hours. The plane took off, headed north, and the first 3 hours of the flight went without hiccup, but while over the northernmost portion of Canada, one of the 3 pilots on board, quote, passed out, according to official sources. The 59-year-old pilot, who had passed a medical examination just earlier in the year, received as much medical attention as possible on the flight, but never regained consciousness.
In March, he had undergone a routine health exam, and no health issues were found that would have prevented him performing his duties.
The 2 remaining pilots made the decision to divert the plane, and sadly, during that diversion, the pilot lost his life. They began heading back south towards the East Coast, and around 6 a.m. local time, the A350 landed at JFK International Airport, where the passengers were deboarded and waited for their flight to be rescheduled. Rest in peace. Tragedy struck the Atlanta airport on Tuesday when a 757's tire exploded, killing 2 Delta employees. On August 27th at around 5 a.m., a Delta maintenance crew was working on a 757 that had arrived from Las Vegas just 2 days earlier. The incident in question occurred in one of Delta's hangars when the crew was changing a tire, according to reports. All I can imagine was the tire was overpressured or had excessive wear, making it weaker, but regardless, during the change, it exploded, sadly killing 2 maintenance workers while severely injuring a third. Delta is, quote, conducting a full investigation to determine what happened, so we don't know any details as of yet, but freak accidents like this are so sad. Make sure to keep the families of the workers in your prayers, and hopefully the third person will make a full recovery as well. This 747 crash killed 520 people. Japan Airlines Flight 123 was scheduled to fly from Tokyo, Japan to Osaka, Japan in a 747 on August 12th, 1985. Today we're going to replicate that flight and subsequent crash. Only 12 minutes after takeoff, that 747, which had been involved in a tail strike incident a few years prior, suffered a severe structural failure and decompression. a Marine F-4 Phantom collided in mid-air with a passenger airliner over the skies of Los Angeles. Hughes Air West Flight 706 was scheduled to fly in a DC-9 from LA to Seattle with a few stops in between. Conversely, around the same time, a U.S. Marines F-4 Phantom was making a journey from Naval Air Station Fallon in Nevada to Marine Corps Air Station El Toro in California. The Phantom in question had recently gone through some diagnostic testing, and the maintenance personnel found issues with its radar, transponder, radio, and oxygen system. So on the return flight, the F-4's crew were instructed to fly at low altitude and use VFR. The Phantom's crew deviated from their flight plan, ironically, to avoid air traffic. Soon after, the F-4 and DC-9 collided, an impact that ripped off the cockpit section of the airliner and the tail of the F-4. Sadly, no one on board the airliner made it out, and similarly, the F-4's pilot failed to eject and was lost as well, but thankfully, at least the Rio in the backseat of the F-4 ejected and survived. This 737's engine failed mid-flight, throwing fragments into the fuselage, causing a rapid decompression and partially sucking one passenger out of the plane. In April of 2018, Southwest Flight 1380 took off from New York's LaGuardia Airport in a 737-700 and began its flight to Dallas Love Field Airport with 144 passengers and 5 crew on board. The aircraft began its climb and had no issues initially, but 30 minutes later, when climbing through 32,000 feet on its way to its cruising altitude, things changed. A fatigue crack in one of the left engine fan blades fractured completely, hit the engine fan case, and resulted in large parts of the engine's cowling breaking off of the aircraft. These pieces damaged the wing, but also the fuselage, shattering a window and causing rapid decompression of the cabin, which partially ejected one passenger. The pilots put on their oxygen mask and began an emergency descent, and they also later reported that the damage done to the aircraft made it much more difficult to control than normal. But nonetheless, only 17 minutes later, after diverting to Philadelphia International Airport, the crew landed the 737 safely, but sadly, the passenger who was partially ejected didn't make it. After a fateful flight planning error, this 757 crashed into a mountain in Colombia, leaving a dog as one of only a few survivors. In December of 1995, a United Airlines 757 took off from Miami International Airport after a 2-hour delay and was headed to Colombia with 163 people on board. The flight went as planned until when approaching their destination, the air traffic controllers asked the pilots if they would like to shoot a straight-in, non-precision approach into runway 19 instead of ILS into runway 1. They agreed, and to descend rapidly enough to make the approach into runway 19, they deployed the plane's speed brakes. Due to a prior mistake, the pilots had to manually enter a waypoint into the flight management system, and in doing so, they entered the wrong one. The autopilot then turned the plane 90 degrees away from their approach course, straight towards a mountain. A short time later, the ground proximity warning system alarmed. The pilots applied full power, began to climb, but because of the speed brakes still being deployed, it wasn't enough. The plane tragically collided with the mountain, killing everyone on board except 4 people and 1 dog. Right after this DC-10 lifted off during takeoff, the left engine, pylon, and 3 feet of the wing's leading edge detached from the plane. American Airlines Flight 191 was meant to take off from Chicago O'Hare International Airport on May 25th of 1979 at 3 in the afternoon and fly to LAX with 258 passengers and 13 crew on board. The DC-10 made its way onto runway 32 right at exactly 3:02 and 46 seconds and began its takeoff roll. It accelerated normally until just before rotation when spectators say they saw white smoke or vapor coming from engine number 1. Just seconds later, as the plane began to take off, the left pylon failed, which resulted in it, as well as engine number 1 and part of the wing's leading edge, detaching from the plane and landing on the runway. It continued to climb, but because the detachment severed hydraulic lines, the slats on the left wing retracted by themselves. Much less lift was now being created by that wing, causing it to dip, and slowly, the entire aircraft uncontrollably banked left through 112 degrees. It crashed soon after, killing everyone on board and 2 people on the ground. It was found later that engine 1's pylon had previously been damaged by improper maintenance at American Airlines. The first ever passenger A320 flight crashed, and because it was during an air show, the whole thing was caught on camera. In 1988, one of the first ever delivered A320s was set to be revealed at an air show. The airport in question had a runway that was too short for the A320, so it had to fly in from Basel Mulhouse Airport, which was just a few short miles away. The plan was to conduct a flyover at only 100 feet for the air show spectators, but that's not what what ended up happening. The plane climbed to only 1,000 feet during its short journey, and with the airport in sight, the pilots began the descent. They hit 100 feet, but they kept descending all the way down to only 30 feet above the runway. They increased power to climb out, but with how low they were, it wasn't enough. The plane continued past the end of the runway into a forest. It caught fire, and sadly, of the 130 passengers on board, 1 woman and 2 children died from smoke inhalation after getting stuck in their seats. The captain went on to argue that the plane's fly-by-wire system was to fault, but that's not what the investigation found. In the end, 5 people were found guilty of manslaughter, including the captain and first officer. This A320 accidentally landed with its gear retracted and then tried to do a go-round. Clearly, it did not end well. In May of 2020, a Pakistan International Airlines A320 was conducting a domestic flight. It was carrying 99 people, and the flight went as planned until they made their approach into Karachi. ATC noticed that the A320 was approaching high and fast. They told them to do an orbit, which is just a 360-degree turn to lose more altitude and airspeed, but the pilots refused. Instead, to accomplish the same thing by increasing drag, they deployed the speed brakes and put the landing gear down. They intercepted the glide slope just a half a mile from the runway, but by this point, they had retracted the landing gear. The plane touched down with its gear still retracted, and the pilots even applied reverse thrust before they realized what was happening. They then applied full thrust and climbed back into the air to attempt a go-round. Unfortunately, too much damage had been done to the engines at this point, and they both failed. The plane crashed into a residential area, killing all on board but 2, and ironically, the gear was extended upon crashing. This ATR lost an engine right after takeoff, then the pilot mistakenly shut down their 1 remaining engine, resulting in a crash that was caught on a dash cam. On February 4th of 2015, a Trans-Asia Airways ATR 72 was scheduled to take off from Taipei in Taiwan at around 11 a.m. with 58 occupants on board. The plane took off without issue and the gear was retracted, but that's about as far as they got before things headed south. 37 seconds after takeoff, engine number 2's auto feather mechanism activated, which automatically feathers the prop during an engine failure to reduce its drag, meaning that engine was no longer producing thrust. The pilot then inadvertently reduced the power on engine 1, the engine that was still working, presumably thinking that that was the engine with the issue. This reduction in thrust meant the plane could no longer maintain its altitude and it quickly approached stall speed. He then feathered and shut down engine 1, which again was the only working engine. He didn't realize the mistake he had made until right before crash, and he could be heard saying, quote, "Wow, pulled back the wrong side throttle." The plane stalled, hit a bridge, and then crashed into a river, but miraculously 15 people survived the tragic incident. This A321 captain's beratement and humiliation of the first officer, as well as his cockiness, resulted in the deadliest plane crash in Pakistan's history. On July 28th of 2010 at 7 in the morning, Air Blue Flight 202 prepared to take off from Jinnah International Airport and was supposed to land in Islamabad after 2 hours, but that never happened. After takeoff, the captain began quizzing the first officer, but not in a reasonable way. It's reported that this quizzing went on for an hour and was even referred to as, quote, humiliating sessions in the final report. This understandably made the first officer lose confidence in himself, and he generally remained quiet for the rest of the flight, refraining from questioning most of the captain's decisions. The crew received clearance to conduct a visual circling approach to runway 12, and in preparation for this landing, the captain asked the first officer to input unauthorized waypoints into the flight management system. The first officer did this without question. These waypoints put the plane far outside the boundaries of the correct approach and close to mountains. This, coupled with the captain not realizing the plane was in nav mode versus heading mode, meant they kept flying towards the mountains. The last thing heard on the voice recorder was the first officer saying, quote, "Sir, we are going down." The A321 then crashed into the mountainside, killing all 152 people on board. This CRJ crashed after its pilots taxied and attempted to take off from the wrong runway that was half the length intended. In August of 2006, Delta Connection Flight 5191 was scheduled to fly from Lexington, Kentucky at Bluegrass Airport to Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson Airport in a CRJ 100 carrying 50 occupants. The crew began taxiing the CRJ to Bluegrass Airport's runway 22, which was 7,000 feet in length, but during this taxi, instead of following the sterile cockpit rules which state that, quote, the crew must not engage in any activity during the critical phase of flight that could cause distraction, they held a casual conversation not pertinent to the flight at hand. This potentially cost the lives of many because during the taxi, while the conversation was being held, instead of crossing runway 26 to get to runway 22, the captain lined up on runway 26 that was only 3,500 feet. The captain then handed over controls to the first officer who was going to be the pilot flying that day, to which he responded, quote, "My brakes, my controls." Takeoff thrust was set and the plane began speeding down the runway, but the 3,500 feet wouldn't be enough. The plane became airborne for a short time, but then hit a berm and then trees off the end of the runway. It burst into flames and only left one survivor, the first officer. I can't imagine the guilt he feels. A member of the Italian acrobatic team Frecce Tricolore crashed during a practice run, killing a 5-year-old girl on the ground. Frecce Tricolore, I'm probably butchering that, is an acrobatic team that's part of the Italian Air Force, comprising of 10 MB-339 aircraft, comparable to groups like the Red Arrows or the Blue Angels if you're not familiar. The team was practicing for a show this Sunday to celebrate the Italian Air Force's 100th anniversary. The group was training out of Turin Caselle Airport in the northwest of Italy when something clearly went wrong. There's rumors that the plane may have collided with a flock of birds, causing an engine failure, but the official report remains to be seen. In this video, you can see the group in formation shortly after their takeoff, but suddenly one of the planes falls below the rest. The pilot ejects and a large fireball emerges from the wreckage. Quite sadly, that plane collided with a family's car, killing a 5-year-old girl and leaving the other child and 2 parents hospitalized. I'll keep you all updated as we learn more, but rest in peace to the little girl. A flight simmer once hijacked a 747 because he just wanted to fly a real plane. A 747 took off from Haneda in Japan on July 23rd of 1999, carrying 503 passengers, one of which had snuck a knife onto the plane. The passenger, Yuji Nishizawa, notified the Ministry of Transport of the security flaw which allowed him to get a knife onto the plane, but they didn't make any changes to fix it. 25 minutes after takeoff, that passenger used the knife to force a flight attendant to allow him into the cockpit. He made the first officer leave the flight deck, stabbed the captain, and took control of the plane. Only about 20 minutes after the hijacking occurred, the crew forcefully regained control of the plane, and First Officer Koga landed the 747 back at Haneda just a few minutes later. It was later found out that the hijacker was on large doses of antidepressants during the incident. Tragically, Captain Nagashiwa died from his injuries, and Nishizawa, the hijacker, was subsequently sentenced to life in prison. Last week, a Piper Seminole was seen quite literally falling from the sky in Oregon. On the evening of Tuesday, October 3rd, a Piper PA-44 owned by Hillsborough Aero Academy, a flight school based near Portland, took off from Hillsborough Airport. It had already completed one flight earlier that day, but this would be its last. The flight lasted a total of about 28 minutes and covered 58 miles. After reaching its max altitude around 7,000 feet, the plane descended to about 5,000, and then something went wrong. As you can see from the footage below, the Piper was caught descending rapidly in an uncontrolled spin until it crashed into a house below.
Pilot and student have died as their light plane plunged into a home in the US state of Oregon.
2 of the plane's occupants sadly did not survive the crash, but the Seminole's 3rd passenger did live, although they sustained what I can only imagine is severe injuries and were airlifted to a hospital. Thankfully, no one was in the house that the plane collided with. Any cause of the accident is just speculation at this point, but if I hear any updates, I'll leave them in the comments, and if you have any insight, please share as well. This man unknowingly live-streamed his own flight crashing, which left no survivors. Yeti Airlines Flight 691 took off from Kathmandu in Nepal on January 15th of 2023 in ATR 72 and began heading to Pokhara International Airport. Takeoff, climb, cruise, and even the descent went as normal, but as they approached, instead of landing on runway 30 as they were assigned, the pilots, for no apparent reason, requested to land on runway 12 instead. This required a tight 180-degree turn right before landing due to the surrounding terrain. While flying downwind just north of the airport with flaps set at 15 degrees, the pilot in command called for, quote, flaps 30, to which the other pilot replied, flaps 30, continued descent. But fatally, the pilot monitoring hadn't set the flaps to 30 degrees. Instead, he had somehow feathered the props, which meant that they were no longer producing thrust. They continued to lose airspeed and altitude simultaneously, never realizing that the props were feathered, and at 10:57 a.m., the aircraft suddenly banked left after stalling and crashed into a riverbank, leaving no survivors. Just earlier this week, a Beechcraft King Air crashed shortly after takeoff, bursting into flames. On October 4th at around 1 p.m., a C-90 Beechcraft King Air began its takeoff at Bom Futuro Municipal Airport in Brazil. It had 1 pilot and 2 passengers on board. Almost immediately after takeoff, the plane began a steep bank left, and the left wing hit the ground, breaking up before crashing into a hangar that was under construction. Sadly, after the plane crashed, it caught fire, claiming the life of the pilot and 1 individual individual on the ground. The 2 passengers seated in the back of the Beechcraft escaped with injuries and were rushed to a hospital on a helicopter. Now, there's no official reason for the crash yet, but I'll let the security footage play, and if you have any idea of the cause, please let us know in the comments, and I'll provide ice to reaccumulate on the wings. The pilots knew this, but they decided not to return to the gate for more de-icing due to fears of delaying the flight further. The pilots also didn't activate the engine's anti-ice system, potentially due to their lack of experience from flying in icy conditions. The first officer noticed that some instruments were displaying incorrectly during takeoff, but the captain decided to keep going nonetheless. After it left the ground, the 737 reached a max altitude of a little over 300 feet before stalling and crashing into the bridge. All in all, 4 motorists died on the bridge. Only 4 of the 74 passengers lived, and 1 of the 5 crew members survived. Russia once shot down an airliner that was carrying 283 passengers. In July of 2014, a Malaysia Airlines 777 took off from Amsterdam and was headed to Kuala Lumpur, a route that would cross Ukraine. Ukraine and Russia had begun fighting in early 2014 following Russia's annexation of Crimea. Some airlines were avoiding eastern Ukrainian airspace due to the risk associated with the area, but because Ukrainian authorities claimed that the surface-to-air missiles in the area weren't operational, Malaysia Airlines kept flying. A few hours after takeoff, when the 777 was over eastern Ukraine, it was hit by a Buk missile fired from a territory controlled by Russian separatist forces. All 283 passengers and 15 crew members were lost. Russia continues to deny responsibility in this incident, and it remains the deadliest airliner shootdown to date. 4 Russians were criminally tried in a Dutch court for the murder of 298 people, but because Russia doesn't extradite its own citizens, they're still free to this day. 3 U.S. Marines were killed and 20 were injured when yesterday a V-22 Osprey crashed during a training exercise in Australia.
3 Marines have died. At least 18 others are injured, including 5 in serious condition.
A V-22 Osprey was carrying 23 Marines and conducting training exercises in Melville Island, Australia, which is in the north. It crashed during that training exercise, and so far 3 Marines have been confirmed dead and 5 others were flown to a hospital in Darwin. Now, we don't have much information about this, but what we do know is the Osprey has had a history of crashing and fatalities. Since 2012, there's been 5 Osprey crashes, including 16 deaths, and many people are skeptical about its safety. But even with the concerns that many people hold and the fact that Ospreys aren't being made anymore, the military plans to use them through the 2050s. Rest in peace to the Marines who died, and I'm hoping for a quick recovery for the ones in the hospital. As more information comes out, I can gladly make another video on this if you guys would like that. A Delta 777 once dumped fuel on 6 schools, sending 60 people to the hospital. On January 14th, 2020, a Delta 777 took off from LAX on its way to Shanghai, China. A flight that's over 13 hours, meaning that their takeoff weight exceeded their max landing weight. Shortly after leaving LAX, the crew reported that they had a compressor stall in the 777's right engine. While heading back to LAX, but still over the Pacific Ocean, air traffic control asked the 777 crew if they wanted to dump fuel over the ocean instead of over land. The pilots declined, saying, quote, "We've got it under control, we're not critical." When the 777 got back over land, they dumped thousands of gallons of fuel over a 5-mile portion of densely populated Los Angeles, showering 6 schools in the fuel. This is what that looked like.
Dousing dozens of children at several schools.
Shortly after dumping that fuel, the 777 fortunately landed safely back at LAX. Which aviation story do you want me to cover next? After crashing twice in less than 5 months, leaving 346 people dead, this plane was grounded worldwide for 20 months. On March 10th, 2019, an Ethiopian 737 MAX 8 took off from Addis Ababa Bole International Airport at 8:30 in the morning. It was on its way to Nairobi, Kenya with 149 passengers and 8 crew members on board. 2 minutes into the flight, the 737's MCAS system activated. I'll put on screen what that is. This caused the plane to go nose down towards the ground. The pilots then disabled that electronic system and tried to manually adjust the plane's trim and pitch it back up. Unfortunately, just 6 minutes after takeoff, the 737 MAX 8 crashed into a farm field at nearly 700 miles an hour. Quite sadly, there were no survivors, and this is one of multiple crashes that caused the 737 MAXs to be grounded, resulting in Boeing losing more than $20 billion, and the 737 MAX is not seeing the skies again for 20 months. This plane crash threw 4 flight attendants onto the runway while still strapped to their seats. On July 6, 2013, an Asiana 777 took off from Incheon International Airport in South Korea on a routine journey to San Francisco. The entire flight went smoothly until it was time to land. During their approach, it was confirmed that they were too shallow and also at too low of an airspeed. At an altitude of 125 feet, just 8 seconds before impact, the 777 had decreased to a very slow 112 knots. The pilots were somehow unaware that the auto throttle wasn't maintaining the speed that they had set. The pilot called for a go-around just 1.5 seconds before impact, but by that time they had decreased to 106 knots and there was no way to avoid crashing. The plane then hit the seawall, detaching the tail section from the rest of the plane. Of the 307 people on board, only 3 died, none of which were the flight attendants that were ejected from the aircraft. It was later confirmed that the crash was due to pilot error. Which aviation story do you want me to cover next? Did you know a B-25 bomber once crashed into the side of the Empire State Building? In 1945, a U.S. Army B-25 bomber on its way from Bedford Army Base in Massachusetts down to Newark in New Jersey crashed into the Empire State Building. Today we're going to replicate that flight and talk about what happened. The B-25 in question, piloted by Lieutenant Colonel William Franklin Smith Jr., was on a routine personnel transport down to Newark, New Jersey, as I said. The pilot asked for clearance to land but was advised that there was zero visibility due to fog. He unwisely decided to proceed anyway, which ended up resulting in this tragedy. At 9:40 a.m., the B-25 crashed into the north side of the Empire State Building between the 78th and 80th floors. And from looking at this, you can imagine how hard it was to see under this much fog. One question I had that I couldn't find the answer to was why were they flying at 1,000 feet of altitude over Manhattan in the first place? That seems to be glossed over in all the articles I looked at, so if you guys know anything, please let me know. Sadly, all the crew members on the B-25 and 11 civilians died in the incident. Clearly, it could have been much worse, but still tragic nonetheless. This 747 had a mid-air explosion and the resulting crash ended up being the 3rd deadliest in US history. On July 17, 1996, a TWA 747 took off from JFK International Airport and was headed to Paris, France. The takeoff went completely as planned and the 747 was then cleared to climb to 15,000 feet. Their last radio transmission happened at 8:30 p.m. when they confirmed that altitude change. Just a short 38 seconds after that, the captain of a 737 along with a bunch of other pilots reported seeing an explosion in the sky. A short circuit in the 747's center wing fuel tank ignited the fuel air vapor, resulting in an explosion so powerful that it split the 747 in half. The front of the plane immediately plummeted into the Atlantic Ocean while the back section, still attached to the wings, had enough speed to generate lift. In total, all 230 souls on board passed away. Which story would you like me to cover next? Less than 24 hours ago, a private jet was reportedly shot down in Russia. It was carrying the leader of the Wagner Group. All 10 on board died. Wagner leader Yevgeny Prigozhin, along with others in command of Wagner, were aboard an Embraer 135 heading to St. Petersburg, Russia from Moscow. Shortly after takeoff, they began falling from the sky, which was all caught on tape. This was presumably after being shot down by a Russian missile. This is significant because last June, the Wagner Group rebelled against Putin's regime. Just one day after that rebellion, they made an agreement with Putin to settle the conflict, which is way out of Putin's character, so he clearly had motive to get rid of the group's leader. But there's still speculation. Was Yevgeny actually on the plane? Was the plane really shot down? Or did it come down for other reasons? Or is this all just some kind of cover-up? This is still very fresh, so there's not much more information we know, but I'll leave you with this footage of the crash so you can make your own conclusions.